You ever had a trip where it just feels like everything seems to go wrong? The last time I went on a longer bike tour was in western Montana. It was about a 300-mile trip from the Bozeman Airport to Flathead Lake for my friend's wedding. And every single day, it felt like I needed to learn a new lesson. A new lesson that I hope will help me in the future, but nonetheless, it wasn't exactly the most pleasant of learning experiences. The first day, I packed in way too much. My flight left San Diego at 6 a.m. and I didn't arrive at Bozeman until about 1 p.m. local time. I still had to assemble my bike, hope I didn't lose or break anything. I had to get lunch, water, and other supplies, and ride 70 miles to my campsite. Luckily, it was summer, so days were long, but it was still way too much. I had also planned on buying bear spray while I was there. You can't fly with it, it's compressed gas, but I had assumed because there are so many bears that you could just buy it at a gas station or liquor store. That is not the case. At least not the ones that I went to. Ultimately, it just set up the day to be way too stressful. I made some bad decisions and really just pushed forward in a way that probably was not responsible. So next time I go on a trip where I have to fly somewhere, my plan is I will not have big mileage on the first day, or I will not have any mileage on the first day, to just focus on being prepared for day one bright and early and get a full day in. In line with that, I didn't really take enough time to plan in general. For example, I didn't know how much of my route was going to be gravel, which slowed me down. I also didn't do enough research into where I could get food or water along the way. And it turned out that in the rural parts of Montana that I was in, the stores and restaurants on the map didn't seem to actually exist, or they were only open on weekends as a sort of like gathering point for the locals. Other than that, people ate at their houses. So I think on these short trips, when I'm trying to get so many miles done and cover so much space in such a short time, I'm gonna do a better job of making sure I understand the actual route that I'm gonna go through. That whole not knowing my route super well really came up in the mid to late afternoon of that first day. The route that I was supposed to take was actually a private road, and there was a gate that indicated as much. I tried to figure out how to route around it, but I couldn't because my offline maps just weren't working right. From what I could tell, it would add about 15 miles to my day, and I didn't have time for that. I was also running low on water, and coming from the Southwest, where there aren't reliable water sources, I wasn't super comfortable filtering water from any natural sources for fear of chemical contamination. So anyways, I decided to jump the fence and take my chances. I've done it here in California with no issues. And so I figured it'd be the same there in Montana. The first, say 5 to 10 miles were amazing. It was the most beautiful part of my trip. It was the most undisturbed nature I had seen. I saw a mother bear and a couple of her cubs, which was really cool. And a little scary, given I have never really been around bears except for the zoo. And eventually I came upon some workers who were repairing the road. And I stopped to talk to one of the workers and asked to pass. And he said, hey, don't worry about it, we're about done, can you just wait 15 minutes? When that 15 minutes was up and they were kind of moving the truck out of the way, I was waiting to go by, and this other worker, he asked me where I was from. And I told him California. And then he asked me if I knew the owner of the property. And I told him no, because I didn't, I was trespassing. And he said, well, you better hope you don't run into the owner. I didn't really think too hard about other than, okay, good to know. I will do my best to just mind my own business and get off the property as soon as possible. Maybe another 5 or 10 miles down the road, they finally caught up to me. And this time in the truck, they stopped ahead of me, waiting for me to approach. And when I did, I got berated for 5 minutes and threatened. They threatened not directly to shoot me, but in his words, he said, you know what happens to people who trespass here in Montana? They're liable to get shot. And as soon as I get off this property and I have cell phone signal again, I'm gonna call the owner, and you better hope you're not here when he arrives. Needless to say, I started moving a lot faster after that point. And I did finally get off the property, and I was still on a dirt road, and it was a very steep uphill, so my progress was much slower. And when I finally made it to the crest of that hill, an ATV pulled up next to me. It turns out this guy also worked on the property, and the first guy really did call it in. He was much nicer to me, but I was shooken up and very apologetic and didn't really know what to do. But he assured me I was getting close to my next destination and where I planned to camp for the night. And so I continued along. And when I got to the sort of town where I had expected to find a gas station or somewhere I could buy some water, maybe some Gatorade or some snacks, I didn't find any of that, but somebody on one of those mini dirt bikes passed me and he gave me the 1,000-mile stare. And if you're not familiar with the 1,000-mile stare, it's basically when you could see someone look at you, but straight through you. And you know that they've disassociated your humanity from you, And that is this, usually a sign that something bad's about to happen. I've been mugged a couple of times and almost mugged a couple of times, and that is the stare that I've always seen before it happened. And he drove past me, and I turned around, and I thought, okay, well, that seems like it's fine because he didn't turn back around to come up from behind me. And then a short while later, like a half mile or mile later, I saw him on top of an overpass watching me ride by. And as I got out of that little town, he came back around off the highway and back down that road, and same thing, 1,000-mile stare again. And I was spooked, honestly. And I wanted nothing more than to not be in a vulnerable situation on my bicycle. But anyways, the lesson of that experience is, in the future, I will really second guess trespassing. And when I finally got to town where I planned to eat, I stopped first at the grocery store to fill up on water and buy some snacks. And I had planned to eat dinner there. There were restaurants on the map that were supposedly going to be open. And when I talked to I think he was the owner of the grocery store, he informed me that it's not so much a restaurant as it is a bar, and they stopped serving food around 7, and it was already well past 7. I thought about taking my chances, but I was really just quite concerned that perhaps some of the people who had harassed me during the day might be at that bar, and that didn't seem like a confrontation I wanted to have. So I decided to eat a couple of protein bars for dinner and just went straight to my campsite to get set up before the sunset. Little did I know, my friend that was getting married in Montana, when he warned me about mosquitoes, he meant mosquitoes. I thought I knew. I traveled to Central America and other places with endemic malaria and tons of mosquitoes, but nothing prepared me for this. When I arrived, I stopped to read the sign. Couldn't have been more than 5 seconds. And in that time, I was swarmed with mosquitoes. A black cloud, a literal black cloud was surrounding my head. And all I wanted to know was what I was supposed to do with my food to avoid attracting bears. And so anyways, I moved from the sign and went towards the campsite, and I couldn't figure out why everyone was in their tents or in their camper. I had wanted to ask people what to do about food, but there was no one around. Kind of an ominous sign, given that the sun was still out and it was a beautiful evening and starting to cool off. But I figured it out real quick because the mosquitoes by the sign were also by the campsite, and I got so swarmed. So miserably swarmed. I went into the bathroom to put on some mosquito repellent, and I'm pretty sure it was mosquito attractant, and that every mosquito within a 5-mile range could smell me and wanted to get a piece of me. I also learned that mosquitoes can bite you through your clothes, which was brand new to me. And so as I was trying to set up my tent, I would brush them off of my exposed arms, only to eventually realize that I had at least 20 to 50 biting me through the back of my shirt and anywhere else that my clothes were tight to my skin. The best remedy I could get for this was to spend about 10 seconds setting up my tent and then run away from the tent, and then go back to the tent and put some things together and latch things and then run away. All in all, it took me over 30 minutes to set up my tent, and I couldn't figure out what to do about bears, and the mosquitoes were driving me crazy. And so I ended up going into the tent and trying to hide from the mosquitoes. Luckily, none of them followed me in that time, but I was still worried about bears and attracting them. And so I'd been told that if all of your food is sealed, and if it's sealed and then in more bags, maybe it's less of an attractant. And so I opted for putting all of my scented stuff and all of my food into one of my Ortlieb roll top waterproof bags, and then put that into another bag. And I also skipped brushing my teeth and cleaning off and eating dinner for fear of having wrappers in the tent and not wanting to leave the tent again because of the mosquitoes. Eventually I had to pee, and I didn't have an empty bottle that I could use, so I had to leave the tent. And when I got back in the tent, 60 mosquitoes, I swear, followed me in, and I was flicking them off the ceiling for 40 minutes. And during the night, I heard an animal rummaging around my tent, and I shined my light on my shoes, and I saw a mouse chewing at my laces. The mosquitoes weren't bad enough, and the fear of bears weren't bad enough. Now I've got mice to deal with. And so I decided to bring my shoes into my tent, but then throughout the night, I heard mice rummaging around, and all I could think was these mice are gonna chew through my tent, my $600 tent. I didn't pay that much, but my $600 tent to get to my shoes. Golly, I thought I knew how to camp, but apparently not. But anyways, in the future, when I'm in mosquito country, I am gonna bring better repellent. I'm gonna arrive at camp while it's much hotter out, set up and be ready to hide in my tent before the mosquitoes come out. And I'm also gonna avoid marshland as best I can, because my goodness, Montana mosquitoes suck. And that was only the first day. On the second day, I had to repeat the same process trying to get my tent put away so that I could leave with the mosquitoes attacking me. And I really don't like wearing DEET, and since my repellent didn't work, I didn't even bother with it, but it was still such a miserable experience until I could get moving fast enough that mosquitoes couldn't catch up with me. And it was a beautiful day and I was making so much progress, and I made it to Helena very early and had a wonderful breakfast, and it was so delightful. And people there were even nice to me. And they asked me where I was going and what my trip was and where I was from. And I had finally gotten far enough away from Bozeman that it was not frowned upon, we'll call it, to be from California. I was just a pleasant tourist. However, I told one person where I was going, and his words to me were, "Wow, that's one heck of a climb." Climbing was not in the plan for the day. I had mapped my route on Google Maps, and it told me that it was mostly flat. It actually ended up being about a 4,000 foot total climb, which I wasn't ready for emotionally, physically, and I didn't really have time for. But at some point I did intersect with the Great Divide, and I was at a gas station that I can almost swear I have seen on documentaries about the route. And I talked to the owner and his family, and they really, really made me feel so much more comfortable. It was a huge morale boost, and it was so encouraging to have somebody who liked bicycle tourists and who also was a bicycle tourist himself. They helped me confirm my route choice, avoiding the main roads and instead taking this beautiful gravel path through forested trees. But the other thing that I hadn't considered is I live at sea level. So when I plan a trip from home, whatever my elevation gain is during the day is some indication of what my max elevation is. Well, in Montana, I started multiple thousands of feet above sea level. And so when I have a 4,000 foot elevation gain day, I really ended up closer to 7,000 feet elevation, which, while not extreme by any means, when you're not prepared for, will make you feel a bit more winded. You can notice being 7,000 feet above sea level. And so back to my first lesson. In the future, I will route my trips much, much better. I'm going to try to use more dedicated bicycle routes. I will cross-reference to get elevation correct, and I will use GPX files, which will hopefully give me a better indication of what I actually signed up for on my trip. So when I finally arrived to town the second day, I realized I didn't want to camp. I just didn't. I'd been hearing about recent grizzly bear attacks ripping bicycle tourists out of their tent at nearby towns. I had a horrible experience the night before, and I just decided, you know what? I'm gonna stay in a hotel. And so I go to the first hotel, assuming that it works like it does where there's reception. And when you get there, you talk to reception, you pay for your room, and they let you in and all is good. That was true of some of the hotels. However, the first one I went to, you called the number and you hope they answered. And I called the first number and got no answer. And I called the second number and got no answer. So I guess I wasn't staying there. So then I went down the road to the next hotel, and this one was fully occupied. Luckily, there was reception at this one though. And she called the owners of the first hotel, no response. Gave me some indication about other hotels that had closed because the original proprietor had since passed away and their family didn't wish to continue to run the hotel. And she recommended that I go to the next hotel over to stay, which sounded fine to me. A roof, no worries about bears, and no mosquitoes. That was all the assurance I need that I was gonna have a good night. At the next hotel, I did get a room, and when I entered my room, I didn't think much of it. But as I started to get comfortable and started unpacking and walking around and eventually used the restroom and took a shower, I realized that camping probably would have been more hygienic than staying in that hotel room. I'm normally not weird about this, but I refused to walk barefoot in there because the floor was so disgusting and damp and gross. When I took my shower, there were other people's hair crusted onto the walls, and the first towel that I grabbed to dry myself had dried blood on it. Oh my God. It was an uncomfortable night, but I was still glad to not have to worry about grizzly bears. And so, yeah, it was a bit much, but it was okay. And luckily the sheets seemed really clean and I just slept clothed and I slept really well because I didn't sleep much the night before. But I did feel a little guilty for not camping because I did fly like 1,100 miles with all my gear and I was only gonna camp 2 nights. So I camped the one night, I didn't camp the second night. And so it seemed kind of like a waste, but a YouTuber named Tim Fitzwater, he says, you know, there's no award for roughing it. There's no like pure bicycle touring where you have to camp or have to do it a certain way. The reality was this was my vacation and I wanted to be comfortable and I wasn't ready for bears and I didn't particularly feel like having another miserable night. And so in the end, I still felt good about staying in a hotel. I only wish I would have realized that I should have called ahead, because I'm almost certain that first hotel, at least by the ratings online, would have been a much cleaner, much more pleasant stay. And it was closer to the restaurant I wanted to eat at anyways. So my third day was out of Lincoln and it was supposed to be downhill into Missoula. I figured it would be a relatively easy ride, kind of good relaxation after the first couple of days where I'd already done big miles. But I learned that you do not underestimate headwinds, because even going downhill, I was pedaling hard in my lowest gear for a lot of the way in and was just exhausted. And it wasn't just any headwind, it was like dry Santa Ana's, in your face, kicking up dust. But the silver lining of the day is I learned my new favorite gas station treat for really warm days. Eventually, when I just couldn't go any further and needed the break from the wind and the pedaling and the exhaustion, I got one of those like super giant big gulps. It must have been at least 128 ounces, probably a full gallon of an Arnold Palmer. So much sugar and caffeine and hopefully electrolytes. It was just a game changer for the day. But the best part is it tastes really good in your water bottle. And unlike carbonated drinks, it doesn't really matter. Eventually I got to Missoula and everything was cool. But I realized that as much as we like to think we're in control, sometimes nature and the world has other plans. So it turns out that just a few miles from where the wedding was supposed to take place, there was a forest fire. And I had heard about it the day before, but there was no smoke, didn't really seem to matter. But when I got to Missoula, I was already exhausted, and I think I was kind of looking for an excuse not to go. And according to the forecast, the smoke pollution, the particulate matter in the air, was supposed to be up around 300 or 400 the next day. And I'd be riding right towards the fire and into a headwind that'd be blowing all the smoke right at me. I kind of didn't really want to go. I didn't really want to ride my bike anymore. It had just been a rough 3 days. And for this particular tour, like I said at the beginning, I was going to a wedding and my girlfriend was going to meet me in the town of the wedding. And so I called her that night and I was trying to convince her that she should take a small detour from the airport she was flying into to pick me up in Missoula and drive me to the wedding. However, she would have, but she didn't want to let me give up that easy. And so we devised a plan and we said, well, the forecast says smoke, but the fire started 4 days ago and it's still not smoky currently. So what is going to change between now and then? Her thoughts were, just take my chances. And worst case scenario, if the smoke gets too bad, find a building to go inside of and she'll come pick me up. I decided to go for it and it ended up working out fine. The only thing I will say is smoke inhalation is really bad. If it's smoky where you're riding, don't push your luck. People get hospitalized and have serious and permanent lung damage from it. And the last lesson I learned on this trip, if you're gonna ride on average 60 to 70 miles a day, you should probably train a little bit. I hadn't thought about this because 60 to 70 miles doesn't really scare me that much, but in the weeks and months leading up to this trip, I had only been riding about 10 miles a week. And so on that fourth day, as I worked my way up the giant hill and back down, let's say that all of my contact points with the bicycle were really starting to hurt. I knew I was gonna have a pretty bad saddle sore, but also, and this hadn't happened to me before, I had numbness in my hand that extended all the way to my middle finger and was throughout all of my finger and my hand. And I had the same for the same digits on my feet. The tingling and the numbness lasted for like a couple of weeks and kind of started to worry me. And the saddle sore I couldn't get rid of for like over 2 months. So just another reminder to not overdo it. It's vacation. You should enjoy it. You should be able to be comfortable sitting down when you get home. But anyways, I'm curious. I want to hear from you. What have been your biggest learning experiences? What's gone wrong on the road? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear it.